I'm going to take a few minutes today to describe some of the exhaust modes that are on my F-Type S. A lot of people who are considering buying the F-Type are interested in the car because they've heard the crazy exhaust that you hear in a lot of the reviews, where there's a large exhaust overrun and burbles, and you sort of get some crackles and pops when you're shifting gears, but not everybody wants that. A lot of cars these days, like BMWs, have artificial noise that's being pumped into the cabin, and some people prefer to have either a quieter exhaust or something that's more natural. And a lot of people assume that the F-Type is always going to be in sort of an obnoxious exhaust mode, but that's not necessarily true. So I'm going to try to explain some of the modes that the car has. The biggest thing, if you get a base model car, my understanding for the 2017s and older, I'm not sure about the 18s and up at this point, but if you buy a base model car, I don't think they come standard with the active exhaust. And basically, the active exhaust allows you to basically toggle via this switch over here whether you want the baffles opened pretty much below 3,500 RPM and down. Now, regardless, my experience is that in my S model, once you hit 3,500 RPM, the baffles on the exhaust are going to open up anyways. But for the majority of your driving, whether you're commuting or daily driving, as long as you don't have a really heavy foot, since the car has 8 speeds and it has a lot of torque, you're really not going to be going above 3,500 RPM at all. The car itself, you know, the red line is cut off somewhere around 7,000 RPM, so it's got a lot of usable power below 3,000. But basically, this button allows you to open up the baffles below 3,500 RPM, and in my opinion, it actually sounds a little bit better with the exhaust closed. When the baffles are closed, I think you get a better exhaust note. I think it sounds a little bit cleaner than when it's open. When it's opened, my honest opinion is that it just sounds louder, not necessarily better. But basically, that's the first sort of option that you're presented with, is the active exhaust button. The second thing you've got is dynamic mode. Dynamic mode is this switch over here. When you want to turn on dynamic mode, you pull back this switch, and that allows you to do a couple of things. I'll turn on the car now and I'll kind of show you what I'm talking about. But in dynamic mode, you can configure several things on the car via the screen that you'll see over here. Dynamic mode allows you to configure the steering, the suspension. So when I move it over, you'll see over here that since dynamic mode is on, I can now configure a couple of things. I can configure basically the engine, whether or not you want the throttle response to be a little bit sharper, the steering, whether or not you want the steering response to be a little bit quicker, the suspension. I personally leave it, even when the car is in dynamic mode, I leave the suspension normal because the roads in my area aren't very good. So I leave that normal. The gear shifting, you can change that to be, it's actually much quicker in dynamic mode. And so you've got those options to configure. When the car is in dynamic mode, it automatically turns on the active exhaust. And so the biggest difference in there is that dynamic mode is when you're going to get a lot of those exhaust overruns, the you know, the burbles, the cracks and the pops when you're shifting gears. That's really what the car needs to be in order for you to get that raspy, kind of crazy exhaust going on. The other thing that you've got at your disposal is if you're going to shift the car manually using the paddles, one thing that you can use to change the exhaust as well is by putting the car in sport. So once the car goes into drive, if I put the car into sport by moving this lever over to the left, and then I start pulling paddles when I'm shifting gears, you're really going to get sort of a pop between each gear change. You'll get a sort of a, it just sounds like a really crisp sound from the exhaust. And so, in my opinion, there's basically three ways. When this car is in dynamic mode with the exhaust on, and then in sport, and you're manually shifting gears, you're going to get the craziest sort of exhaust note. If you move it just over into drive and leave it just in dynamic with the exhaust on, you will get still sort of a lot of the crazy exhaust that everyone talks about, but not necessarily just when you're shifting gears. Mostly when you're bringing the RPMs up and you let off the gas, that's when you're going to hear sort of the backfiring and the popping. When you turn off dynamic mode, you'll notice that this screen sort of goes away, and in my case, you know, the exhaust is completely quiet now, and really the car the exhaust is pretty docile. You don't really hear it at all. I don't think there's any artificial noise being pumped into the interior of the car. That's, you know, what my ears are telling me. But given that the car is a hatchback, you're going to hear some of the exhaust anyway. So I'll take the car out on the road now and sort of give you a little bit of a run through of basically what the actual exhaust sounds like in the different modes.